Okay, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I'm the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Boudreau.
Hi, today we have Professor James Galbraith. He's the Lloyd Benson Chair in Government and Business Relations and Professor of Government at the University of Texas, Austin. Welcome.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to just start out with a comment about your Kennan lecture the other day, and you can react however you want. One of the things that you talked about was the changes in economics departments in universities and the adoption of this sort of very limited model where we've reached the end of history. Countries are now going to be transitioning to capitalism and liberal democracy in a certain particular system, and that's just taken sort of for granted. And all of these kind of various economic models and thoughts from decades and decades of economic theorizing have just sort of been tossed out of windows because we've decided what it is, and that has sort of ossified. If I followed you correctly.
Quite fair summary of what I was saying. I think if you go back to let's just as far as the middle of the 20th century, and ask who were the prominent economists of that period, it was a very eclectic group, and they had grown out of the practical experience of the Depression, the New Deal in the United States, of the mobilization and the management of the war economy in the 1940s, and into the post-war period. They were engaged in the development of the welfare state in the U.S. and in the U.K. and in Europe. So this was a group whose credentials were rooted in the intersection between academic and political life. They were people of serious experience and in many cases of technical expertise. An economics department would have specialists in agriculture, in transportation, in urban development, and there was, of course, a powerful movement and that had importance in Milwaukee of the followers of Henry George and the land taxation, this kind of thing. And all of this was basically phased out, if not actually swept away, by a kind of homogenization of the thinking of economics departments, a generation of people who were, largely speaking, purely academics, who thought you could distill some kind of universal model and universal guide to policy out of first principles, out of axioms. And so they were working from elementary notions of supply and demand, leading toward equilibrium, the ideal of perfect competition. All these things that first year economics students have drilled into their heads became the foundation of the way the discipline thinks. And as a result, people who actually have, let's say, either deep experience or deep research-based knowledge of the world, they haven't disappeared entirely, but they've become quite rare, and they're not central. They're not the people who the leading academic departments seek out, and they're not the people who go into government either.
Now, one thing that resonated about that portion of the lecture was you've used you referred to it as being like a theology. It's like this was more like a religion, and I've kind of had that feeling for a long time that economics is great as long as it's a science and it's tested in reality. And a lot of what you see, kind of the mainstream economics that is now in the mass media that's winning Nobel economics prizes is more on this kind of like taken for granted. Like it's more of a faith. It's resistant to real life conditions, and it's derived intellectually purely.
Let me first of all say a word in defense of the Nobel Committee and the Nobel Prize, because there is not an economics Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize in chemistry, or medicine, or physics, or literature, or peace is given by an institution that was set up under, out of the Alfred Nobel legacy, and that's those serious prizes by and large. I'm going to say no one could defend the Nobel Peace Prize in every single case that it's given, but in any event, these are serious prizes. The economics prize is given by the Swedish central bank, the Riksbank, and it's a synthetic prize. It's in economic science in memory of Alfred Nobel. So it sort of skirts in on the coattails that, of course, was established much later. I think the first ones were given around 1970. And it reflects the ideology of the conventional mainstream as expressed by some very conservative over the years, very conservative, mostly Scandinavian economists. Off the air, I could tell some funny stories about that.
All right. Oh, I'd love to hear them if we had time. I just a quick shift to what was kind of the next segment of the lecture, because I think they're closely connected. I want to draw this observation. You talked about how at the collapse of the Soviet Union, what they tried to build up in its place after basically throwing everything out was this. What period was a disaster, right? And China also kind of was looking at this and narrowly avoided having a similar disaster. And you talked about how in both those countries there was prompted by either crisis or visible crisis on the horizon, a open-ended search for solutions. So creative, pragmatic approaches to what's going to come next, not going back to the past, not going back to what Western economists were prescribing, but finding a path of their own. And it's if I've gotten that correct, and it seems to me that that expresses a sort of creativity and imagination that is sort of precisely what you've talked about having sort of been thrown out in Western institutions in our universities.
Well, the two situations had important differences, and the Soviet one was much more serious all the way through, because the industrial model of the Soviet Union had become sclerotic. It was a nation where essentially nothing worked, although in spite of the fact that it had extremely advanced education, scientific establishments. It simply could not make its distribution networks or its consumer good products function at a level that the population was coming to demand. So this was a serious situation. Obviously, Gorbachev in his time tried to initiate reforms, but they didn't work. So when it collapsed, and it collapsed as a consequence and part of the desire of Russia to exit from its situation, essentially being the sponsor of all the other Soviet republics, so many of which, in particular Ukraine, were wealthier than Russia was inside the Soviet Union. So it veered sharply toward a free market ideology, and that accentuated the social decline. It produced essentially a social catastrophe. Life expectancy for men fell below 60 years. The rates of violence and alcoholism and unemployment, all hyperinflation was all was a really very, very grim situation, from which Russia only began to recover around 1998. So there was practically a decade of, following a long period of stagnation, a decade of collapse. This is what China avoided. China had its own situation was not as, let's say, it didn't start out as deeply close to collapse as the Soviets. And it moved over, you might say the reform process in China started seriously with after the death of Mao in 1976. So there was ongoing change already underway by the time the Soviet Union fell in 1992. And China managed to make its development process work in a step-by-step manner, beginning, generally speaking, with agricultural reform, and then moving on to the modernization and the building up of a vast consumer goods industry. which was the first Soviet socialist country to actually produce consumer goods that were of a standard that could be sold around the world, and especially in the West.
And they certainly have.
And they certainly have, yes, sure.
So, I mean, I do see though, when I see news of China, I see all the things that they've accomplished in, just sort of continuing on, year after year, decade after decade, sort of solving problems, and they appear to be very flexible and very able to move things very quickly. I do have this sense, and I don't know if you share it, that there is so much pragmatism and imagination and creativity in solving problems, whereas we've largely lost that capacity. At least, and the U.S. government has lost a lot of its capacities, and I think you referred to that as well in response to various questions as well. It just seems like there's been this shift of creativity and imagination from here, where I think we once had it, and now we sort of have become very ossified, versus the sort of developing China and Russia and much of the global South seems to have this creativity that we once had and we do not have anymore.
Well, let's go back to perhaps the greatest of the American economists, Thorstein Veblen.
I'm going to give you gross generalizations. You're going to correct me.
But Veblen, in a book that was published in the early 1904, The Theory of Business Enterprise, maybe roughly about that time, argued that it was the interrelationship between working population and the machine process that created the capacity to build on make technical improvements on a continuing basis, because that was what gave you a sense of how to interact with the material artifacts of the world. Well, what happened in the United States in the neoliberal period from the 1970s onward is that we built an economy that was rooted in finance, which is a pure numbers game, and in information technology, which is largely a software game, a coding game. And we priced ourselves out of the world markets for advanced machinery, which were located, many of them right here in Milwaukee. So the people who understood the interaction between physical artifacts, technology, and new engineering developments simply ceased to be a major part of the U.S. economy. Maybe the energy sector is another matter, but in the machinery sector, the sector that's responsible for infrastructure, for new products, and for complicated networks, this has deeply eroded in this country. Where did it go? One of the places it went was China, and you have a lot of scientific and engineering talent, which can be applied to such things as building the world's largest network of high-speed rail, for example, but also a great many other things. I don't want to go too far here, because I edit a journal which gets a great many submissions from Chinese academics. And what I can see is that there is an enormous influence of Western neoliberal economics coming up in China now. And I say, okay, if this actually becomes the leading force in the Chinese state, then they're going to fall into trouble too down the road. But that's not where they are now.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about the interaction of sort of people on the ground with the machinery, I immediately think of the guy who invented the blue LED. I mean, it's a fascinating story. I mean, you had scientists trying to crack this puzzle of creating the blue light LED, which has given us these fantastic bulbs now. Scientists were going at this for years and years and years, and the guy who finally cracked it was the guy who was like one of the engineers, and he got his PhD while he was working on these machines that are being used to make the diodes. Then it's like he had all this sort of hands-on knowledge about the process that the scientists were just saying, build this machine for me to do this, and he was the guy who was like building them, and he figured it all out. So I really that just came to mind in terms of.
I think this is a very important and very characteristic story that. In order to advance science, you have to be able to master the relevant technology. If you don't have the machinery, then you can't develop the measurements which underpin scientific advances. So there's a close interaction between these things. And what's happened? I mean, you can see the detachment in economics. because what has happened is that a generation of economists who actually understood, because they had deep personal involvement with, let's say, agriculture or transportation, that's disappeared in favor of people who basically, in my generation, chalk and blackboards, but now laptops.
Right.
Somewhere I used to have my father's slide rule. I don't think I have it anymore, but it was a great instrument. So when at the event yesterday, because you gave this Kennan lecture, Betsy asked a question about BRICS and the move away from the dollar. And one of your responses was that you thought that for some inherent reasons, the dollar would be very resilient and that this would not be an easy task. And I've heard this as well, too. But I'd like to understand a little better what makes the dollar as the world reserve currency so resilient and makes it so hard to move away from using it.
When we speak of the dollar, what we're really speaking of is the bonds and bills issued by the United States Treasury, which are denominated in dollars. This is an asset. It yields interest. It's extremely secure insofar as the Treasury is going to always refinance, pay interest, and so forth, and meet its obligations. That is a large liquid market. You can easily trade them and so forth. So there's a question of what alternative reserve asset would you use if you want to move away from the dollar. Well, for that, you need to have a country that's issuing a lot of external bonds. That's not, the Chinese are not doing that because they haven't had to finance a large trade deficit. The Russians, for obvious reasons, are not a great source of bonds that people would buy to hold for long term because the ruble's a volatile currency. And then one could talk about rupees and Brazilian reais and so forth. But this you could put together a package, but this is a complex problem. So for most of the world, the combination of the dollar and to some extent euro assets has been and continues to be the predominant financial asset that governments and other major holders will hold. Nothing is necessarily forever, but I wouldn't anticipate a rapid collapse in that system. It has the countries that do not wish to trade or settle their trade in dollars can, of course, move to bilateral settlement. There's no reason why you can't trade between China and Russia in RMB and rubles. With those, if you have a balanced trade, those transactions cancel each other out. Of course, you can buy in one currency and sell back in the other. So it's not that's not necessarily closely related to the reserve asset question, or at least it's related, but it's not determinative of what's going to happen to the reserve asset. So my view is that the system is has a reasonable degree of resilience, notwithstanding the fact that a large part, that many governments in the world would prefer, ideally, to have some other system.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you mentioned is, I mean, I think most people are kind of conditioned to think in the short term and feel like whatever we have now is what will last forever. And you say nothing lasts forever, and it's like I think there are a lot of people here that just do not have the imagination to think that anything is going to be vastly different in the future. And in the short term, that may very well be true. Day to day, nothing changes. I think I heard someone say recently that you always overestimate what you can get done in a day, but you always underestimate what will happen over 20 years. And so I'm wondering if you look further on down the road, you could maybe have a very serious shift over the course of decades, not in the course of weeks or months or a couple of years, but
it's certainly possible. In the 19th century, the reserve asset was sterling. The British Empire, those assets were held by Britons colonies, by India in particular, which became one of the largest creditors of England, which is one of the reasons why India was able to become independent in 1947. So things do change, but and they do change, and the position of the United States at the center of the world financial system was initially buttressed by a combination of its post-war industrial strength and its post-war military strength, both of which have been eroding. And the industrial strength has been eroding now, seriously since the 1970s, so for 50 years, and it's clear that it's now at a fairly advanced stage of erosion. And the military strength is being, if you say, leapfrogged by new generations of technology. It is based upon bases and aircraft carriers and things of this nature, which are vulnerable to the new generation of long-range and high-precision missiles. These evolutionary waves come and they undermine the source of financial strength. But there still has to be a question of what's the alternative, and will that alternative be pursued with real determination by a unified, let's say, a unified group of countries seeking out an alternative system, and that remains to be seen. I don't rule it out, but and obviously there are moves in that direction. But I wouldn't say that we've reached the tipping point yet.
Yeah, I mean, sure.
Yeah. For a while, it looked like the European Union was up and coming, and those countries were really, particularly Germany, very powerful economically. But with this war in Ukraine and things like the Nord Stream pipeline being blown up, that all seems to have just vanished in like that, I don't know if I'm correct on that. But.
I mean, I wouldn't say like that, but the European position's eroding very badly, for sure. And the euro as a financial asset, the European bonds were never a real first-rank competitor to U.S. Treasury bonds because they were never issued by the European Union as a whole. They were issued by Italy, Greece, Spain, and of course, you'll buy some Italian bonds, but you wouldn't make your portfolio in Italian bonds when the alternative is United States Treasuries. The scale of the thing is just very, very, very different. But what has happened recently is that the Europeans have, now to a substantial extent, sabotaged their own resource base. And they've done this in the first instance in Germany by moving away rather abruptly from their nuclear power stations, which Angela Merkel did in the wake of the Fukushima disaster. And then by substantially cutting themselves, but also being cut off from the very economical source of Russian pipeline-based natural gas, with oil also still available in Europe, but at a substantially higher price because it now comes through India and other channels in order to dodge the sanctions. So the European, and particularly Germany, has been suffering a precipitous decline in its core industrial and chemicals and in automobiles and machinery, and this is the beneficiary of this is on one side China, but on the other side also the United States, because the U.S. still has a substantial base of its own resources, and so there was a certain amount of corporate movement out of Europe to production platforms here.
We're nearly out of time actually, but
I did have
okay.
to ask. yesterday at the Kennan lecture, you mentioned that the sanctions that were put on Russia after coming into invading Ukraine could not really be seen as a failure. But you have to say that, they did certainly not work out the way the U.S. was looking at.
I would make that point in two parts. First is whether the sanctions had an effect. Were they, in a sense, effective in doing what they mechanically were set out to do? For example, in depriving Russian industry of components, or persuading firms, automobile firms and others, to leave Russia. The answer is that happened, and that's agreed to by analysts in both in Russia as well as in the United States. The Russian Academy of Sciences issued a report. This was in the September of 2022, saying that the effect of the sanctions, I think I could quote it, had a severe crisis impact on all sectors of the Russian economy. So they didn't mince words; they were hit. But then the question is, what happened next? And the second part of that argument is the advocates of sanctions believe that the consequence would be a collapse of the Russian economy and an end of the popular support for the government and its war effort. That did not happen. And there were two things. One is that the immediate crisis was handled reasonably effectively. Inflation was brought under control. The ruble was returned to its pre-war exchange rate quite quickly. And the second part is that the industrial economy adapted and revived. It had, first of all, relatively low resource costs, because among other things, they weren't exporting all the natural gas. So fuel prices in Russia were stable in ruble terms. Secondly, they were able to basically substitute in components that they were missing. They have good engineers and they have good networks, and they figure out how to do this. Some of that is probably evasion of sanctions, but it's also basically doing at home what you were previously buying from Germany or Japan or someplace. Thirdly, the Western companies leaving the Russian market meant that there was a market there that was bigger and competition was less, so the profit opportunities were there. So the idea that this was some sort of, reversion to the Soviet planning system requiring some bureaucrat to figure out how to do things, just misses the fact that over 25 or 30 years, Russia has become a business economy with the kind of people running companies who are like people who run companies anywhere. And they think about where their markets are and how to put together a package that's attractive and how to make profit out of it. And they discovered that the climate for doing so inside Russia was improved by the effect of the sanctions, because basically the sanctions put up a protective wall around Russian businesses that the Russian government would not have been able to erect on its own in 2022. That would have been impeded by the oligarchs, who were tied both ways, by the fact that it has at least some pretensions to maintaining legality. So would it have gone to a Japanese automobile manufacturer, or a Swedish furniture store like IKEA, and said, "Get out of here"? They would never have done that. That would have been alienating their own middle class, and for what would look like very, political and probably corrupt purposes. Yeah. But instead, the West handed that to them. Did it all for them. Did it for them. So from that point of view, I wrote the article in published it, I think, in April of 2023, so quite early on, and I entitled it "The Gift of Sanctions." That this was something and that comes back to what we were saying earlier about economics and economists. The arguments behind those policies were rooted in mainstream conventional and textbook economics, and how, and explicitly so. I mean, I quote chief economist of the U.S. Treasury Department explaining the reasoning. And it's very clear. It's straight out of, some production function approach from a textbook. And if you think that way, you are going to get the results of what you do wrong. I won't say 100 times out of 100, but certainly 90 or 95 times out of 100. There are so many examples I could multiply them into a book, and in fact, I am exactly what I'm doing at the moment.
I was going to say that seemed to me like one of the major factors on miscalculating this so badly. The other two things I can sort of see in this are one of the things you referenced, that we seem to have this view of Russia that's set 25 years in the past. We seem to fail to acknowledge all the changes that have occurred there. You see the same thing regarding China, where it seems like we have this view of China that is like trapped in 1988 or something. And the other thing is just this sort of just this feeling of hubris that whatever we do cannot fail. That there's no understanding that we've tried a lot of these types of things. A lot of things we've tried have just over and over have fallen flat on their faces. We don't seem to learn that we're not invincible, that we're not perfect, that we don't continually get things right. In fact, seems like we continually get things wrong.
Well, this is going to have to change with generational turnover in the United States, because it seems to me that what has happened is that we've been led for 30 years now by people who first came into public life and positions of power in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, there were two chief ideas. One was the triumph of the single way of thinking. There is no alternative. The Reagan, Thatcher, the era of big government is over, all of that. The free market, the dominance of free market ideology became complete in the 1990s. And secondly, the point that you're just making was that these people who they had some experience of Russia, perhaps, and of China, certainly of Russia, maybe less of China in the 1990s, came away with a deeply condescending view that the Russians had produced the collapsed Soviet economy and were incapable of organizing themselves into a market economy. Well, beginning in 1998, with the default and devaluation of the ruble, and conditions began to change, let's say, modern business economy began to emerge in Russia. Of course, the process had been going on in China, much bigger country with a much greater, let's say, impetus in that direction, and much greater success overall for a longer period of time. And we haven't come to grips with the fact that the world that has emerged now, is already a multipolar world. It's already a multipolar world. It is not rooted in a single way of thinking about, or a single way of being governed. It is not converging on the end of history, or the world is flat. Yes, and the kind of triumphalism of the 1990s is now very thoroughly out of date. But the people who grew up in that period, it's my generation, or maybe a little bit younger actually, are still around. They're still running the show. And it will probably have to wait until a new realistic generation takes the reins.
That sounds hopeful. I think, I was going to say, I've probably been hearing from TV preachers since I was 8 years old about how America is just like the Roman Empire, and that we're destined to fall, and the second coming is coming next Thursday, and that's and here it is. It's like 40, 50 years later, and it seems like the signs of U.S. imperial decline are all around, and you have this China with this huge economy, and you have the emergence of the global South in many ways coming up and up and up, and it seems like, well, here it is sort of, but I also could see it coming 50 years ago, and it's still not here. So I think these things take a long time, and there's still a chance to fix it. I don't think we're like a Trantor and Isaac Asimov's foundation, that the decline is at the point where it can never be stopped.
I've forgotten who it was who made the remark about how you go broke, first slowly and then quickly.
Well, that's true.
So, but to forestall what is forestall here what is now, I think, unfolding in the United Kingdom, which is now, what, half a century past the end of the British Empire, and is falling quite quickly into conditions where serious sort of poverty is it's a major social decline, it's a major questions. We still have a reasonable possibility of forestalling that, but we have to adjust and recreate, first of all, a global security environment that we can live with, and that recognize that we are not the only major player on the planet, and that we do not specify the rules for everybody else, but we have to respect the fact that other countries have indefeasible interests. So that's the first point. And secondly, to adjust to our, let's say, the disposition of our resources. We have a vast number of military bases around the world, which are, they start as power projection and ended up as targets. What good are they? Expensive targets. What good are they doing? We need to reassess this. We've had to do this in the past. The era of the battleship was reassessed when Billy Mitchell showed that you could sink the things with an airplane, right? And then the era of the aircraft carrier is clearly at coming to an end. Sure. So we need to think about these things in a serious way, and be able to act on them in a serious way before let's say, we reach a crisis point where the adjustments are simply forced on us, and we suffer consequences that we could avoid.
Well, I think we have to end it there, because I'm not sure. I haven't gotten the alert from Zoom that they're about to cut us off, but this was a 40-minute link and we've gone 40 minutes. And you only promised us 10, and I know you have a plane to catch. So at this point, I just thank you very much for just sitting and chatting with us. We appreciate it a lot.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
James Galbraith. So now we're ready for our next guest.
Yes. Professor Jeffrey Sommers of UWM's Institute of World Affairs will be discussing with us the upcoming election.
All right. And again, friend of the show, common guest, thanks for being back. So you had an article, and I think I've seen a bunch of articles now. I don't usually like to do a lot of horse race stuff, but the election is almost upon us, and we've got the Harris-Trump race, and you had some observations about that. Why don't you just give us the gist of your recent article, and we can talk from there.
Yeah, the article essentially just focuses on the swing states in the election, and how there are some signals which suggest there could be problems for Harris. Doesn't indicate that there necessarily will be, but nonetheless, there is certainly not any cause for, I think, confidence in terms of the Democrats winning the presidential election. In the state of Wisconsin, we see the polling essentially, dead even. Same thing in the swing state of Pennsylvania. And in these two states, one of the things that we've seen, but especially in Wisconsin, in the past two presidential elections, is that when people are polled, especially Trump voters, they lie. And we don't entirely know the reason for this. We can hazard some guesses. One, that it's just fun, throwing some gum into the works of the polling. And others have suggested that perhaps, well, maybe there's some small margin of voters that are ashamed of voting for Trump. So these two factors combine to throw the polls off. And by the 2016 election, they were off some 5 to 6 points. With 2020, maybe even 6, 7, or 8%. So that is quite substantial. And given the fact that the polling shows Harris and Trump are completely even right now for the state of Wisconsin, again, as I said, Pennsylvania as well. If that pattern is one that is continuing, it would suggest that Trump is in fact quite well ahead. But we don't know. Of course, we're just hazarding guesses based on the past two elections. Yeah,
one thing I like about 538 is its lack of confidence. Because if you look at 538, I think Harris peaked at like a 62% chance of winning the election, and now she's at like 53%. Right? She's they have it as pretty close to a toss-up. And in contrast to that, you've got right now, some people on Twitter, like Lord Bebo and Polymarket, will say that Trump has it in the bag. You've got like Saturday Night Live having a sketch whose premise is that the Democrats have it in the bag. I don't think anyone has it in the bag. But
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it speaks to a, I guess, state of psychological unease and insecurity that people need to assert that it's in the bag when it's anything but. It's far too close to make assertions like that, but people seem to have a psychological need to have that confidence.
yeah, and 537 got like roundly chastised after 2016 because they said Trump had a 38% chance of winning the election, and then he did. It's like, right. Well, what about 38%? Don't you understand? We said this could happen, and it did. So we didn't put all of our money on Clinton. And they had been like chastised incredibly before that because they didn't have Clinton at 99% like everyone else did. And so it's like they were actually the best predictor. And right now they have like 100 electoral votes right in the middle that are within 1%. I mean, just this vast body of swing states, Michigan, Arizona, even Florida is only a couple of points. Even Texas is only a few points, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, this, to my mind, this kind of speaks to neoliberalism and an economic order which has tried to deliver on, I guess, what economists would call a Adam Smithian allocative efficiency. And in politics, we seem to see that reflected in our political parties so evenly having carved out their electorates so as to achieve a roughly even distribution of votes. So in other words, there really doesn't seem to be anything like principle, arguably, involved in terms of policy. It's just about grabbing those electorates. And when you've got two parties that are very well funded going at it, it seems as though they've done it with the utmost efficiency and have ended up with these elections, which are very uncertain in terms of their outcome because they are so evenly split in terms of their electorate. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Well, the cynic would say that the elections are all a big game and it's all theater, and that they intentionally keep it even so they can use the opponent as their main draw for getting people to vote for them, right? You have to keep the risk of the enemy strong, otherwise no one will vote for you to keep the enemy out, and then you have to do whatever that is they tell you to do. In this way, you get to pick whatever policies you want and just say they're worse.
See that in the ads. You have the Trump ads saying,
Kamala's a communist.
Yeah, and she can never be our president. That type of ad, and being very against kind of immigration issues and some policies, whether or not it's true or not, about advocating for sex changes for even immigrants or prisoners or whoever. Anyways, so you have that. And then you have on the other side, other ads saying that Trump can never be the president and saying, what a disaster he would be and how fearful he is.
Suspend the Constitution on day one, that sort of thing. A lot of which is, grossly exaggerated on both sides. Not that there isn't some threat on either side, but.
That inflation of fear, of course, is very useful in that it helps one to raise cash. But of course, it's also good for generating enthusiasm, negative enthusiasm, I guess, in defining your opponent negatively for getting voters out. On some level, I think it does tend to turn off some voters, I guess, a little bit. But it seems to be working in terms of. A lot of those
voters have already been turned off for years, though. So
But on another level, we're seeing voting at higher levels than we have in the past couple of generations. So. There's something about, to my mind, the 2008 economic crisis and the kind of precarity that has persisted since that period of time that has generated this ongoing anxiety and has driven people actually to the polls. In other words, to the voting polls. So we don't do it for reasons of civic engagement any longer. In other words, you were trying to be a good citizen and trying to make a rational choice. Now it's all about, again, fear, anxiety, preventing the other side from gaining traction and getting into office. But then, of course, at the end of the day, I think many people are disappointed in the results in terms of not seeing much in the way of immediate change in policy. Although we can say that there are real consequences of one particular party or another winning, and that typically, I think, happens with the judiciary. Mm-hmm. And it has long-standing effects or impacts that are not necessarily visible to voters, but nonetheless are there, and they tend to last for years and years and years. So there are real stakes in terms of who actually wins.
Yeah, I did want to ask if it seems that the parties seem to have switched as far as who they're appealing to. You see the Democrats saying that they have all these Republicans backing them, whether it's Dick or Liz Cheney, whether it's
a list of like 80 CEOs and 80 former Bush officials and 80 former Reagan officials. I mean, it just seems like they're definitely courting Republicans, and
the Republicans seem to be quoting at least a
lot of African American voters.
Yes, actually some, and that seems unusual, and also the white middle class or low wage voters.
Yeah, this kind of realignment that's happening in slow motion is interesting. There's no doubt. I mean, with Republicans capturing more of the working class vote, white working class vote, but also, as you stated, more African American votes, more Hispanic votes. I'll use that term just because it's the one that ethnic group seems to prefer. Not majorities, but nonetheless larger minorities than they have captured in previous election cycles. And I think it's a consequence in part of the Democrats really not delivering much in the way of policy change that's made their lives better. So there's some.
Yeah, I mean, it was just amazing to me that that people had to lobby Harris to actually have policies. I mean, for the first portion of the election, she had a website up that had buttons to donate and volunteer, but had no policy content at all. And
so the initial rollout of the campaign was one which was very disappointing to my mind. It just was as if they thought that they could reprise the kind of Obama feel-good campaign, or even going back to Bill Clinton, which had a certain element of this as well. So, they were going to spread this fairy dust of joy everywhere, and everyone was just going to feel great.
I mean, it was amazing how explicit it was, because you had like these reports saying, her team was telling her not to have policies. I mean, it's like, what?
Who knows who could be offended by that?
Yeah, I mean, just to me, that's like, it's bizarre, but it's also kind of seems like it's kind of a trend that's been going on for decades, where things have been much more openly acknowledged. I mean, remember the time when I think it was the senior Bush said, well, those are campaigns, this is election, so of course I'm going to break all my promises. And it's like, well, the people were kind of expecting you would break most of your promises, but we were expecting you not to say out loud that you were going to break your promises before you'd broken them.
Right. Well, think about if you go to, say, who goes to them anymore? They almost don't exist. But if you go to a bookstore and you go to the magazine section, it used to be, we're old enough to remember this, say 40 years ago, right. They would be filled with journals and magazines that reflected some substantive editorial, lane. And they, there were a lot of serious publications. And then, of course, we saw, I guess, with the advent of neoliberals and this shift eventually just over to lifestyle stuff, right? And so there was this kind of absence of any kind of meaningful content beyond some kind of culture and lifestyle issues. And so we've certainly seen that reflected increasingly in the Democratic Party. And I'm thinking about Harris and how they would set up these obvious pre-planned photo and video opportunities for her, where she would do something like go into a used record store, pop out and declare that, she just found this great Charles Mingus LP or something like that. That's designed to appeal to some upper middle class educated person working in some professional capacity that wants to be flattered because of their cultural choices. But, we're, again, just not seeing much in the way of policy. Now, quite recently, the Harris campaign has been staking some ground in terms of policy with respect to seniors being able to use their Medicare to get long-term in-home care and things like that. So it seems as though they're finally starting to try and address some policy issues that will benefit people and carve out a larger slice of the electorate based on those kinds of actions. But yeah, we've seen precious little of that. And I certainly wouldn't count on this Harris administration, if it comes into office, doing much to advance these kinds of policies. I mean, we'll see. It seems like their interest has been more in serving as the voice of Silicon Valley and Wall Street capital, so coastal capital, providing, again, some kind of flattery to them in terms of sharing, whatever their cultural aesthetics are. And then, maybe throwing the working class, some kind of bone or another, but certainly ones that will not cost too much. And then, of course, you would mention some Republicans going over to the Democratic side of the political ledger, and I think that's a consequence of both this uncertainty and unpredictability that Trump brings. So on one level, he brings tax cuts. Okay, so you like that if you're in business, and we've seen that in Wisconsin. I mean, that's been one of the chief motivating factors of the Republican party leadership in the state, is just to deliver low taxes, which allows older, kind of non-innovative legacy industries to survive. That plus low wages. If you can do those two things, they can, squeeze out another generation of profits before eventually going under. But and then of course, if you're a foreign policy neocon type, well, then you have maybe some faith in Harris continuing to deliver on the score of the United States trying to manage the global system, which means lots of weapon sales and I guess
it's largely the same policy, but more consistent and predictable, because you don't have the random factor of Trump throwing whatever strange thing into the mix that day.
No, exactly. Right. So he's very unpredictable, and you don't know essentially who's going to be making policy within a Trump administration. So, I mean, I dislike Trump, and I think that he would be a disaster for the federal judiciary, not to mention the Supreme Court as well. So, just personally, I'm not going to be voting for him, but I'll be voting against him. But you have to, at least for me, I have to admit, I took a little bit of pleasure in seeing how he would just toy with John Bolton on the issue of Iran, kind of like keep him on a chrome leash. And whenever Bolton wanted to take a lunge at Iran and take a chunk out of them, Trump would say, not so fast, I'm pulling you back. And so there's that element of Trump that I think many Republicans here, Cheney's in particular, are quite upset with. They want a more forceful United States abroad, and one which carries the cops' bludgeon and baton and makes sure that everything is in order.
Yeah.
You do have the issue of him saying that he'd solve the Ukraine war, or the Russia's war in Ukraine and our proxy war in a day. I mean, that doesn't seem likely, but it does have that again, throwing the wrench in the works type of thing.
If he spends 24 hours on it and then butts out, then maybe he'll start something.
Right. Yeah. But for those who are very invested in that conflict in one way or another, and so you have Ukrainian nationalists who, on one level, understandably, are seeing this as an existential threat to their existence, this war. But I'm not going to get into the dimension of how, in a typical Greek tragedy fashion, that the very thing that they're trying to prevent, they're actually.
We have another 2 minutes. Please talk about the Ukraine war.
Yeah. Right. But it's very disconcerting if you're part of a Ukrainian nationalist community and you're worried about the future of existence of your country, to see a figure like Trump just tossing about these almost random comments regarding the future of your country.
One sort of difference and parallelism at the same time is, it seems like Trump tries to appeal to everyone by announcing 5 completely inconsistent policies that could never work together because they're the exact opposites, and telling every single one of them and getting a few cheers for each one of them. Whereas the Harris campaign does the opposite and doesn't commit herself to a policy, because she wants everyone to sort of imagine in their own minds that they will follow the policies that they like.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, so it's you've got these all things to everyone, but in 2 completely different styles. One which was very vocal and gives every policy, and one which was very silent and gives none.
Right. And the Democratic strategy, just in terms of political style, seems to reflect what arguably one sees in the popular culture, or even in academia, for instance, where I reside, which is somehow having influence by scolding your opponent, using shame, using social pressure, etc. In the area of international relations, I would say that has about 0.00 impact, and can even be something that generates very unwelcome outcomes. In other words, it just doesn't affect those who are trying to advance a some element of the national interest.
Right. It may be good for alienating someone and making it harder to come up with some sort of agreement with them or pushing them into being hostile, but it doesn't really much good for changing their policy construction.
No, and in fact, it may just solidify an opposition to you. But I think this is one of those weird areas where Trump actually is probably more right than wrong when it comes to how you engage some of your adversaries. I mean, there is a certain degree of negotiation that requires first staking out some claim that you're going to pull back by a margin of half, and then maybe eventually you'll find some agreement, or also just not completely insulting your adversary either, and then coming together on some point of mutual agreement. So, I mean, these are things actually that are kind of sensible. Well,
it's one area where the Democrats seem to have been very fickle to me is that, when Obama was saying, I'd talk to leaders I don't like, and everyone was like, well, he's got such a mature foreign policy, he's willing to talk to North Korea, he's willing to talk to all these other countries. And it's like, then when Trump does it, it's like, oh, see how evil he is, he talks to dictators. And it's like, anything that Democrats like on Thursday, they'll dislike on Friday if Trump has done it. It just seems like so completely instrumental and unprincipled.
Right.
I was interested to see the students protesting out front of the when Kamala Harris recently visited UWM, and outside her talk, they were marching in the streets and protesting the alignment with Israel's genocidal war in Gaza.
Yeah, that's certainly going to be an important issue in this election as well, just in terms of whether or not much of the youth vote decides not to come out as a consequence of the Biden/Harris administrations.
Well, it could be a banner year for the Green Party.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's what helped give us Trump in 2016. So we'll see.
I would put that much differently, because I don't think the Democrats own my vote. I mean, it's my vote, and I can give it to the Greens, I can give it to the Democrats, I can give it to whoever I want, and it's not a vote for Trump to vote for someone other than Harris.
Because they probably otherwise just wouldn't vote at all, or just clearly
that's
not
how
that way.
Right. I mean, that's how the
if you're thinking of staying at home, vote Green instead.
Right. If you're
or write in whoever you like.
Yeah, I mean,
if you don't care, who's going to win, if you don't have a preference for either Trump or Harris, and then you can vote for somebody else. I mean, it's
I mean you might have a preference for Harris, or you might even have a preference for Trump, and still think that in the long run, I just can't accept the lesser evil in this case, because that dynamic works against you in the long run. We can have this discussion, but it will take a whole hour, and I think we're already over time. So
sure.
Actually, we are probably way over time.
Any last thoughts?
I would encourage people to vote, regardless of everything that has just been said.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's important, and I think that we need to continue applying pressure to those that we wish to execute policy on behalf of our names. Yes,
I vote. Find someone that you like and give money. Lobby. Give money to a cause. Go out in the street and protest. Do everything in the world other than vote, and also vote too.
Right.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Sommers.
We have a Concord. Always great seeing you guys. You take care.
Right. Yeah, sorry we didn't have a little more time. All right.
No worries.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.